She pressed play, and a dead man's voice filled the room. That was the moment Eleanor Voss's life split into a before and an after. She did not know it yet. She thought she was simply cataloging donated estate boxes for a small historical archive in upstate New York. But what she was about to hear would pull her into a story the state of New York had spent 56 years trying to make disappear. Now, let me tell you the story no one was supposed to hear. Blackwood Asylum for the Insane closed its doors in 1971, officially due to budgetary restructuring and the modernization of psychiatric care. Unofficially, the facility had been the subject of 3 internal investigations, 2 unpublished newspaper exposés, and a lawsuit that vanished from court records almost as quickly as it was filed. By the time the last patients were transferred out, Blackwood had already become the kind of place locals mentioned only in lowered voices. The crumbling brick complex on the hill outside the small town of Ashford Hollow, its windows boarded, its grounds slowly swallowed by birch and bramble. Eleanor Voss had grown up 30 miles from those gates and had heard the stories her whole life. Every child in the county had. There was the one about the orderly who quit overnight and never spoke again. The one about the ambulance that arrived twice a month, always after midnight, always leaving before dawn. Children dared each other to touch the outer fence. Adults changed the subject when it came up at dinner tables. Eleanor hadn't thought about any of it in years, not until a donation box arrived at the Historical Society where she volunteered 3 days a week, sent anonymously from an estate sale in a neighboring county. The accompanying note was brief, typed on an old manual typewriter. Contents belong to Ruth Calloway. Please preserve. Do not discard. Inside were the personal effects of a woman who had worked at Blackwood as a nurse from 1965 until its closure. Ruth had died the previous winter, alone, in a state-run nursing home 2 counties away, with no listed next of kin and no obituary beyond a single line in a local paper. Most of the box was unremarkable. Folded uniforms, still smelling faintly of mothballs. Photographs of Ruth as a young woman, smiling stiffly beside coworkers Eleanor didn't recognize. A rosary, the beads worn smooth. A stack of unopened greeting cards, never mailed, addressed to names Eleanor would later learn belonged to patients who had died decades ago. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a wool scarf as though it were something fragile or dangerous, Eleanor found a reel-to-reel audio cassette. It was hand-labeled in fading ink with a single word, Marlowe. She had no idea, in that moment, that the name belonged to a patient who, according to every official record the state of New York had ever produced, had never existed. Eleanor's first instinct was professional curiosity, nothing more. She catalogued the tape the way she catalogued everything else, noting its condition on an intake form, filing it under Calloway. R. Personal effects. It was mostly out of boredom, on a slow Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later, that she finally borrowed a reel-to-reel player from a retired sound engineer named Marcus Webb, who volunteered at the Society's small music archive and had a soft spot for lost recordings nobody else wanted to bother with. "You sure this isn't just somebody's wedding?" Marcus had joked, threading the tape through the machine's worn heads. "Half these old reels turn out to be somebody's cousin's polka band." It was not a wedding. What Eleanor heard instead was 40 minutes of a man's voice, low and hoarse, recorded in fragments, as if someone had stopped and started the machine dozens of times over what might have been days, or weeks, or longer. He gave his name as Thomas Marlowe. He said he had been a patient at Blackwood Asylum since the spring of 1968. He described, in careful, deliberate sentences, the sentences of a man who had rehearsed them many times in his head before daring to speak them aloud, a section of the asylum he called the East Wing, beneath the East Wing, a floor. He insisted. That did not appear on any blueprint, that visitors were never told about, that even most of the staff did not know existed. Eleanor assumed, at first, that she was listening to the ramblings of a mentally ill man from an era when psychiatric institutions were notorious for their brutal misunderstanding of mental illness, an era of restraints, of overcrowding, of treatments that would now be classified as torture, tragic, but not remarkable. Marcus, listening beside her, said as much. "Poor bastard," he muttered. "They probably locked him up for being sad." Eleanor nearly filed the tape away as exactly that, a sad artifact of a cruel century, nothing more. Then, out of nothing but thoroughness, she requested Blackwood's surviving admission records from the state archive, expecting the request to be a formality, a box to check, before she moved on to the next donation. The reply took 6 weeks. When it finally came, it consisted of a single photocopied ledger page and a note from the archivist. No record found under requested name. Please confirm spelling and date range. She confirmed both. She tried again. She requested intake logs, discharge records, death certificates filed by the county between 1968 and 1971, and even the surviving fragments of Blackwood's internal correspondence that had somehow escaped whatever purge had claimed the rest. There was no Thomas Marlowe. Not anywhere. Not in a single surviving document connected to Blackwood Asylum. But Ruth Calloway had kept his tape wrapped in wool for over 50 years, moving it from apartment to apartment, nursing home to nursing home, until the day she died, and had never once, according to anyone who had known her, mentioned him to a living soul. Imagine spending 5 decades of your life carrying a piece of evidence you were too afraid to use, keeping it close enough to never lose, but never once handing it to anyone who might act on it. That was the question that began to consume Eleanor. Why would Ruth Calloway, a woman by all accounts devout, careful, and quietly respected in her community, hide a recording instead of destroying it or reporting it to someone, anyone? In 56 years? Eleanor began digging into what little remained of Ruth's life, tracking down former co-workers, most now in their 80s and 90s, scattered across 3 states. Most remembered little. A few remembered nothing at all, or claimed to. One remembered something else. Dolores Fenn had worked alongside Ruth for 3 years as an orderly, and now lived in an assisted living facility outside Rochester. She was sharp-eyed, and when Eleanor mentioned Blackwood's name, something in her posture changed to bracing, the way a person braces before stepping onto ice they already suspect is thin. She asked for a transfer out of the East Wing in the spring of 1969, Dolores said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands without drinking from it. Wouldn't say why. Just said she couldn't go back down there. We all just figured it was the smell or the screaming. Down there, you got used to tuning things out. You had to, or you didn't last. Eleanor pressed. Down where exactly? Dolores's expression tightened. She said there had been a stairwell behind the laundry room, sealed with a chain-locked iron grate that led to a sub-basement level the staff called, without any particular affection, the Hollow, a bleak, private joke on the town's own name. Officially, the space was condemned, flooded, structurally unsound, closed to all personnel by order of the state fire marshal. Unofficially, Dolores said, certain patients were taken down there on nights when the hospital's administrator, a man named Dr. Aldous Finch, wanted what the staff euphemistically called quiet handling. What does that mean? Eleanor asked. Quiet handling? Dolores set the coffee cup down with a small, precise click against the saucer. It means we didn't ask, she said. And if you asked twice, you found yourself transferred somewhere far less pleasant than the laundry room. She would say no more that day. When Eleanor pushed gently, asking whether Dolores remembered a patient named Marlowe, the older woman's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with age. She stood up, thanked Eleanor for the coffee, and left without another word, moving faster than her cane should have allowed. Eleanor drove home that night with the tape recorder on the passenger seat, Marlowe's voice looping in her mind, the east wing beneath the east wing, and a growing, uncomfortable certainty settling in her chest. Ruth Calloway had not kept that cassette out of guilt alone. She had kept it because, on some level, she believed someone might still be listening. Picture yourself alone in an archive after hours, headphones on, the building empty around you, listening to a stranger describe his own disappearance in real time. On her third full listen, Eleanor began transcribing the tape word for word, and it was only then that the fragments started to form a shape. Marlowe did not sound unstable. He sounded methodical, the voice of a man building a case, dating his entries as best he could without a calendar, describing his surroundings with the precision of someone who expected, one day, to be believed, even if he no longer expected to survive long enough to see it happen. He described a room beneath the hollow, lined with file cabinets that held no names, Blackwood's official records ever acknowledged. He described patients brought in through a separate service entrance at the rear of the property, off the books, sometimes for as little as a few days, sometimes for weeks at a time, before being either released with no memory of the interval, his word, reassigned, or simply never seen again by the general ward. He mentioned a rotating group of visitors who were not hospital staff at all, men in plain gray suits, who arrived twice a month in a car with no plates that Marlowe or anyone else had ever managed to see clearly, who spoke with Dr. Finch behind a locked office door, and who left each time carrying folders that had not been in their hands when they arrived. And near the end of the tape, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, as though he feared even the recording machine might betray him, he said something that made the hair rise on Eleanor's arms as she listened in the dark. "They're not treating anyone down here," Marlowe said. "They're testing something. I don't know what. I don't think I want to know what. And I think Nurse Calloway knows more than she lets on. I think that's why she looks at me the way she does, like she's already grieving someone who hasn't died yet." The tape ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with the muffled sound of a door opening somewhere behind him, hurried footsteps, and then nothing but static, 41 minutes and 6 seconds after it began. Eleanor sat in the dark archive for a long time after that, staring at the frozen reel. The word, reassigned, repeating in her head like something caught on a loop of its own devising. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, and for one irrational moment she found herself certain that if she looked up, she would see a face at the window that had no business being there. There was no face, but the fear did not leave her, not that night and not for many nights afterward. She had one more thread from the tape she hadn't yet pulled, and every instinct told her it would not lead anywhere comfortable, Dr. Aldous Finch. Public records painted him as a respected, if severe, figure, a psychiatrist trained at a well-regarded Eastern medical school, appointed administrator of Blackwood in 1963, credited in a handful of surviving newsletters with modernizing patient care protocols. His name appeared on hospital letterhead, on a handful of academic papers about institutional management, and then, abruptly, nowhere at all after 1971, the same year Blackwood closed. Eleanor found no obituary, no retirement announcement, no forwarding address in any directory she could access. Aldous Finch simply stopped existing in the public record the same year the Asylum did, as cleanly as Thomas Marlowe had never existed in it at all. She tracked down one more former employee willing to talk, a groundskeeper named Walt Pruitt, 91 years old, living alone on a small farm outside Ashford Hollow, who remembered Finch with an expression Eleanor would later describe to a friend as the look of a man remembering a bad winter he'd hoped never to think about again. Finch wasn't cruel, exactly, Walt said, sitting on his porch with a shotgun leaning, unremarked upon, against the railing beside him. Cruel men, you can see coming. Finch was worse. Finch was curious. He looked at people the way you'd look at a bug you were about to pin to a board, not with hatred, just with interest. That's the kind of man who ends up running a place like the Hollow. Walt confirmed what Dolores had only hinted at. Unmarked vehicles, late-night arrivals, a section of the building that officially did not exist and that no ordinary staff member was ever permitted to enter. He also offered something new, a name Eleanor had not yet encountered. He said that in the final year before Blackwood closed, rumors had spread among the groundskeeping staff about a woman who had come looking for her husband, a man who had been admitted for what the family had been told was a temporary evaluation, and who was never released, transferred, or acknowledged as a patient again. The woman had come back 3 times, Walt said, before she stopped coming at all. "Nobody ever told us what happened to her," Walt said quietly. "Or to him. Some things around that place you learned not to ask twice." Eleanor thanked him, drove home in silence, and did not sleep that night. She kept thinking about the phrase Walt had used, "a bug you were about to pin to a board," and about Marlowe's voice on the tape, describing men who left Dr. Finch's office carrying folders they had not arrived with. She almost didn't check. It was a passing thought at first, the kind you try to dismiss and then find you cannot stop turning over. Eleanor's grandmother, Josephine Voss, had spent 18 months in psychiatric care in the late 1960s, a fact the family discussed only in careful, sanitized terms: a rest, a difficult period, never a hospital, and certainly never Blackwood by name. Eleanor had always assumed the euphemisms were simply a generation's discomfort with mental illness, the kind of quiet shame that had once surrounded so many private struggles. That night, unable to sleep, she pulled the one surviving box of her grandmother's papers from the back of her own closet. The box she had inherited after Josephine's death 6 years earlier and had never fully gone through, telling herself each time that she wasn't ready. She was ready now, whether she wanted to be or not. Near the bottom of the box, folded inside the spine of an old family Bible, was a single discharge slip, the paper gone soft and brittle with age. Blackwood Asylum, Ashford Hollow, New York. Discharged. June 1969. Eleanor sat on her bedroom floor with the paper in her hands for what felt like a very long time, and Marlowe's voice from the tape returned to her unbidden twice a month. Men in plain suits. They left with folders, and a cold, specific dread settled into her chest, heavier than anything the research alone had produced. Her grandmother had been discharged in June of 1969, the very same season Ruth Calloway had requested her transfer out of the East Wing, the very same season. Eleanor now realized with a chill that Marlowe's recorded entries appeared to stop. Had Josephine Voss been one of the patients taken down to the Hollow? Had she known Marlowe passed him in a hallway, exchanged a glance, a name, a warning? Was that the reason her family's history of that period had always felt like a room with the lights deliberately kept off, a door everyone in the family had silently agreed never to open? Eleanor realized, sitting there on the floor of her childhood bedroom with her grandmother's discharge slip trembling slightly in her hands, that she was no longer researching a stranger's disappearance. She was researching her own family's silence, and somewhere beneath the frost-heaved foundations of a condemned asylum 30 miles from where she now sat, there might still be an answer waiting for someone to finally ask the question no one in her family had ever dared to. Blackwood Asylum still stands, technically. The state classified the building as structurally condemned in 1988 and fenced the property, though the fence has long since collapsed in several places, and local teenagers treat the ruin as a rite of passage dare, the way children in every small town eventually do with the haunted house on the hill. Eleanor drove out there on a gray October afternoon, transcript folded in her coat pocket, her grandmother's discharge slip tucked carefully into a plastic sleeve beside it. She stood at the edge of the property for nearly 20 minutes before she made herself walk toward the door, watching the building's dark windows the way you watch something you suspect might be watching you back. Inside, the smell hit her first: mildew, rust, decades of standing water, and underneath it something colder and harder to name: Her flashlight beam swept across peeling walls, collapsed ceiling tiles, graffiti layered over graffiti in a dozen different decades of teenage bravado. She found the laundry room Dolores Fenn had described without much difficulty. It was smaller than she'd imagined, and the stairwell behind it had partially collapsed. Its floor caved into rubble and standing black water, any grate or chain long since rusted into the debris. Whatever had happened beneath that building, the building itself seemed determined to keep the secret sealed with it, as though it had been built, or had settled, over 50 years of decay to guard its own silence. She was ready to leave, disappointed and cold, and increasingly certain the physical evidence had been lost to time along with everything else, when her flashlight caught something behind a rusted filing cabinet, in what had once been an administrative office on the ground floor, a room the vandals seemed to have mostly ignored, perhaps because it held nothing obviously interesting to smash. Wedged behind the cabinet, water-stained but legible, was a single manila folder. Eleanor's hands were not entirely steady as she opened it. Inside were admission notes for a patient listed only as J. Voss, dated April 1000, 968, and clipped to the front, typed and initialed but never signed with a full name, was a note that she would read a dozen times over the following weeks, trying and failing to make it mean something other than what it plainly said. Subject responsive. Recommend continuation of East Wing protocol. Family to be informed of standard discharge only. Eleanor stood in that ruined office for a long time, the folder trembling slightly in her hands, the October wind moving through the broken windows behind her like something breathing. Somewhere in that same building, half a century earlier, a man named Thomas Marlowe had sat in the dark and recorded his own voice onto a cassette tape, hoping someone, someday, would believe him. Somewhere in that same building, her grandmother had been a name in a file the state had promised her family would never need to see. Eleanor has not yet decided what she will do with everything she found, whether to publish the transcript, hand the folder to a journalist with more resources and more legal protection than a small-town historical society volunteer, or simply keep it the way Ruth Calloway once did, wrapped carefully and waiting for a moment that may never fully arrive. She has requested Blackwood's sealed state records twice more since her visit to the ruin. Both requests were denied, citing ongoing archival review, a phrase that 6 months ago she would have accepted without a second thought, and that now strikes her as almost darkly funny, coming from an institution that has had 56 years to review anything it wanted to. She still has the tape. She still has the folder. She still has her grandmother's discharge slip, and the questions it raises that no living relative has been willing, or perhaps able, to answer. Josephine Voss died 6 years ago without ever once mentioning the name Marlowe, without ever once mentioning the East Wing, without ever once, as far as Eleanor can determine, telling anyone in her family the truth about those 18 months. Whether that silence was fear or trauma or something closer to what Marlowe described on the tape, a kind of quiet, deliberate erasure, performed on her rather than by her, Eleanor may never fully know. What she does know is this. Somewhere in the sealed archives of a state that has spent half a century insisting Thomas Marlowe never existed, there are almost certainly more folders like the one she found behind that rusted cabinet. More families who were told arrest instead of the truth. More names quietly left off intake logs that were never meant to be checked twice. And somewhere beneath the frozen, collapsed ground of Ashford Hollow, a door that was locked from the outside for over half a century is still, in some sense, closed. Not because the building demands it, but because no one has yet found the courage to fully open it. Whether anything or anyone is still waiting on the other side of that silence, Eleanor Voss has not yet found the courage to ask out loud. But she keeps the tape close now, the way Ruth Calloway once did. Not hidden, not forgotten, waiting.